Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss a common mistake made amongst pollsters, which could be making the Tory vote share polls look, if anything, better than they really are. But it's also relevant to an aspect of Brexit polling that I've discussed on the channel before. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel. So yeah, it's quite a bit of breaking news this morning, but I'm going to go over this first because I've done quite a few videos on polling of late. And that's because they've been getting a lot more attention in recent weeks publicly. Everything's about polling. Almost every day there's some news to do with polling. But polling and polling analysis is something about which the vast majority of the population, including politicians and journalists, know absolutely nothing. And yet they'll see a poll and think it tells them something. So I do these videos to try and point out a few things to watch out for when looking at polling results. In this video, it was prompted by a really good point raised by Beyond Topline on Twitter. I'm going to discuss false recall. Particularly important because it doesn't just mess with some voting intention polls, but also some Brexit polls as well, which I want to talk about at the end of the video. But voting intention first. So Beyond Topline questions why there is such disparity between the Conservative vote share amongst pollsters. You've got some pollsters saying the Conservatives are on 20%, YouGov. You've got other ones saying they're on about 29%, right? The clue is the fact that YouGov, which is one of the two pollsters I keep saying are very good at this, give the Tories the lower share. And it's to do with false recall. And I often say that the polling for voting intention is incredibly difficult. You know, when I say this pollster's useless or that pollster's useless, I don't mean as polling companies. I mean for things like voting intention, which is stunningly difficult. Most pollsters aren't up to it. The only reason I even refer to like the poll of polls, which averages out lots of polls, is because if you do that, people can't accuse you of being selective. Oh, you're only picking that poll because you like it. So, you know, but in reality, the poll of polls cannot be accurate because most of the pollsters involved in it make basic errors. And we cannot seriously hope that all of these errors are of equal and opposite impact and cancelling each other out. That being said, the trends on a poll of poll are still useful, so I use them for that. But any voting intention methodology has to be based on a number of things, including past voting behaviour. All voting intention polls need to know how respondents voted at the last election, as well as a number of other data, in order to sort of categorise them. But what if the way a respondent says they voted isn't actually the way they did vote? And no, I'm not saying they're lying. You know, what's the point of lying to a computer in an anonymous poll? But because the human brain just makes up false memories, this can impact our answers. And this isn't hypothetical. YouGov tried it out a few years ago. They asked a group of people how they'd voted in 2017, just after the election, a couple of weeks after the election, so they definitely remembered, then you're not going to forget who you voted for in 2 weeks. Then they asked the same people again 2 years later. These are the results. Of their sample, 33% said they voted Labour in 2017, but YouGov knew it was actually 41%. Because they'd asked the exact same people. These are people, I mean, I sign up to the YouGov thing to do polls, so they sort of know it's the same people. And a significant number of people had just forgotten who they'd voted for 2 years before. And look at how the charts change. Fewer people remember voting Labour than really did, but more people think they voted for other parties than they really did. Possibly because their brain has convinced them that they voted in the way that they probably wished they'd voted at the time. What YouGov have here is proof that the way people say they voted from as little as 2 years before cannot be said to be accurate. Now remember that because I'm going to come back to that point. But the impact of this is, if you do not take into account this false recall of voting behaviour, you create a serious source of inaccuracy into your voting intention polls. Right now, I will bet my right buttock that if YouGov carried out the same exercise, some of the people who voted Conservative in 2019 will say they voted for someone else. And maybe more people will say they voted Labour than really did this time. And YouGov can take account of this because they know how respondents voted compared with how they say they vote, so they can work out roughly what proportion of people responding to the poll are giving accurate answers, right? You know, because they have got a large sample already where they asked them straight after the election and then asked them again some years later. But, and I didn't realise this, Beyond Topline says that they are of the belief that most pollsters do not take account of this. When they ask someone how they voted in the previous election, even years later, they don't actually check if it's true. They don't even consider whether it's true, as YouGov do. Now, if this is indeed the case, and it is believable, which again, I'll come up to my own anecdotal evidence a bit later, it may explain why some pollsters have the Conservative share of the vote significantly higher than YouGov. Not so much a case of YouGov being mean to the Tories as the other pollsters including what is effectively false data into their model, not deliberately, but you know. And just to highlight how much of an impact this might be happening, YouGov have the Tories on 20% of the vote right now. The poll of polls that I use has them on 25%. And that's the average, which means some pollsters have them on much more. As I say, it's up to about 29% with some. Which means that anyone going by the average of polls will obviously still see the Conservatives as doing badly, but may think they're doing better than they really are. They may not realise just how badly, which is fine by me from a practical point of view, because it will keep Labour honest and make the Tories a bit more complacent than they might otherwise be. And just for a laugh, in terms of seat projection, the average of the polls currently puts the Tories on 118 seats. Now, you might think, wow, that's a disaster for the Tories, isn't it? Absolute disaster. But the YouGov poll, using the same MRP calculator, puts them on 42 seats. Now you're talking. That is the difference this makes as well. Not that I'm saying the YouGov poll will be perfect. I've said a few times, I think they're inflating the Reform UK vote, for example. And you know, they're not dead on. It's just the fact of the matter is that over the past couple of general elections, it is YouGov who have impressed with their own polling. Ipsos Mori doing well too. Those two, as far as I'm concerned, have proven themselves in battle, so to speak. But we know that the reason is that they tend to take the details very seriously in a way that some other pollsters don't. I think some other polling companies are just ordinary polling companies who go, someone wants to commission us to do voting intention. Yeah, we'll do what we can with that. But they're not really specialists at it. They do it because someone's paid them to do it, but they're not specialists. So that's how the polls may actually be flattering the Tories. Now, what about Brexit polling? Well, let me tell you about a fringe event I attended at the Labour conference. It was hosted by UK in a Change in Europe and also included contributions from Stella Creasy, who is the chair of the Labour movement for Europe. Now, it was actually quite interesting. I'd intended to do a video after it and I never did. Maybe at some point in the future, it'll be quite evergreen. But on the issue of polling, I had this particular question about polling and I asked them both a question. Because there's a suggestion that Brexit polls, at the moment you think, it's all going one way. People are, really dissatisfied with Brexit, all the rest of it. But Brexit polls are generally, as far as can be told, not taking into account the fact that many more Leave voters than Remain voters have died. In other words, what seems to be happening is they're forcing the electorate as it is now onto the 2016 template of voters. In other words, a lot of polls assume that 52% of the population voted Leave and 48% of the voting population voted Remain. But no, that's different now because way more Leave voters have died than Remain voters. Because we know, just statistically, we know that 70% of elderly people voted Leave, which means 30% voted Remain. Stop moaning. And opposite for young people, 70% of young people voted Remain, only 30% voted Leave, roughly. So, but also we have this same problem of false recall, because another thing that happens with Brexit polling, in order for them to make sure it's representative, they don't just have the wrong ratio, they ask people how they voted in 2016. But that referendum was 7.5 years ago. Now, if people can forget how they voted 2 years ago, as YouGov have proven, how much shakier are the memories after more than 7? And the response I got when I asked this question was not encouraging. So UK for a Change in Europe said that they did not account for this. They just came straight out and said, we don't account for this, that they have to trust people on how they voted when they give their responses. Now, again, look at this chart on voting intention, and this was after 2 years. We can see how people say they voted just 2 years later is not even a close fit for how they actually voted. That's 2 years, not 7.5 years. This is a significant error entering the model if you do not account for it. Then Stella Creasy for Labour Movement for Europe tried to comfort me by saying, oh, don't worry yourself. We use a top pollster for our research, you see. And I went, okay, great. And she said, we use Delta Poll. Now, those of you who remember me talking about this particular polling company in the past will understand that at that point, my face fell. It was like telling someone that Mr. Bean was going to house sit to look after your collection of priceless Ming vases. Delta Poll are one of the absolute worst for this sort of polling. I'm not saying they're a useless polling company. I'm not criticising them as a polling company. They may well be able to do normal public opinion polls well enough. But any poll which requires you to know how someone voted a few years ago that does not take into account false recall is going to give you the wrong results. And Delta Poll get way more wrong than that. So hopefully that draws your attention to another little wrinkle when considering why polling companies cannot seem to agree with one another with the snapshot results, even if general trends are broadly in agreement. It may also be as well that if you're looking at an average of polls or even just random polls, the share of the vote that the Conservatives are currently on is probably lower. And also when you're looking at Brexit polls, and if you're looking at the number of people who regret Brexit and so on, you may find that actually support for Brexit is lower even than the polls suggest right now, because polling companies may accidentally not be accurately representing the country at large because they're still working on the assumption that 52% of voters voted leave. And they're also failing to take into account that if they ask a respondent, oh, so how did you vote, remain or leave? Whatever they say may not be true. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.